Story 1. The Watcher in the Woods. For years, hikers had flocked to the hemlock forest, enchanted by its towering trees and untouched wilderness. Nestled deep within the heart of the woods was an old, seldom-used trail known only to seasoned hikers. It was said to lead to an abandoned fire lookout tower that offered an unrivaled view of the valley below. Despite its charm, locals had a name for the trail: the Watcher's Path. Jordan, a seasoned outdoorsman, had heard about the trail on an online hiking forum. Ignoring the locals' warnings, he decided to tackle it solo. Armed with a map, supplies, and his trusty camera, he ventured into the dense forest early one Saturday morning. The first few hours were peaceful. Hemlock trees towered above him, their thick branches creating a natural roof that dimmed the light even at midday. The quiet was unsettling at first, but soon Jordan embraced it, reveling in the solitude. The forest floor was soft underfoot, covered in layers of pine needles and moss. But around noon, things started to change. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. At first, he dismissed it as paranoia, a common reaction to being alone in such isolation. But then he began to hear subtle sounds, rustling in the bushes, a distant snap of twigs, as if someone or something was following him. Stopping, Jordan scanned the trees. Nothing. His heart pounded harder with each step. He decided to set up camp early, hoping to ease his growing anxiety. By the time he pitched his tent and built a small fire, dusk had begun to fall, casting long shadows through the trees. That night, Jordan slept fitfully, awaking several times to the sound of footsteps just outside his tent. Each time, he mustered the courage to unzip the flap and peer out, only to be met with nothing but the inky blackness of the woods. At dawn, he packed up quickly, intent on finishing the trail and reaching the lookout tower. But as he hiked, the feeling of being watched intensified. He noticed something odd: small, deliberate arrangements of sticks and stones scattered along the path, as if someone had left them as markers. Each time he passed one, he felt a growing sense of dread. By midday, he finally reached the fire lookout. The tower was old and decrepit, its wooden beams creaking in the wind. Jordan climbed to the top, hoping the view would be worth the eerie journey. As he stood on the platform, surveying the valley below, he felt a wave of relief. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something, or someone, standing at the edge of the forest, a tall figure, barely visible through the trees. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring up at him. Panicked, Jordan grabbed his camera and zoomed in, but the figure had disappeared. That night, he descended from the lookout and decided to leave the forest immediately. The oppressive feeling of being watched never left him, and as he hurried down the trail, he swore he could hear footsteps behind him, always just out of sight. He didn't stop until he was safely back in his car. Jordan never returned to the hemlock forest. Months later, while reviewing the photos from his hike, he noticed something chilling. In several images, just barely visible among the trees, was a dark humanoid figure watching him from the distance. Story 2. The Whispering Trees. 6 friends decided to take a weekend trip to the renowned Witchwood Forest, known for its supernatural legends and eerie atmosphere. The tales were old, passed down through generations, stories of lost travelers, vanishing campsites, and strange voices that lured hikers deeper into the woods. But none of the 6 friends believed in such nonsense. It was all just folklore to them. They arrived at the forest on a bright Friday afternoon, spirits high and laughing as they set up camp near a tranquil stream. By the time the sun set, they had a roaring fire and were already swapping ghost stories. They didn't notice the way the forest grew unnaturally silent as darkness fell, the way the wind seemed to pick up only when they stopped talking. That night, as the group slept, Tessa, the lightest sleeper, was the first to awaken. She lay in her tent, hearing faint whispers outside, almost like a conversation carried on the wind. At first, she thought it was one of her friends, but when she listened closely, she realized the voices were coming from the trees themselves. Curiosity got the best of her. Unzipping her tent, Tessa stepped out into the cold night. The campfire had long since died, and the forest was pitch black. The whispers seemed to grow louder surrounding her. She turned toward the trees, squinting in the darkness. The voices were unintelligible, but they sounded urgent, insistent. Suddenly, a cold hand gripped her arm. Startled, she turned to see no one there. The whispers stopped. Tessa rushed back to her tent, shaken. She spent the rest of the night lying awake, but when morning came, she convinced herself it had been a bad dream. The group spent the day hiking deeper into the forest, exploring trails that hadn't been touched in years. As they moved deeper, the atmosphere grew heavier, more oppressive. The air was thick, and the trees seemed to crowd closer, as though trying to keep them from leaving. By dusk, they set up camp again. This time, all of them heard the whispers, low, faint, but unmistakable. "Who's talking?" asked Mike, his voice shaky. No one answered. They all huddled closer to the fire, glancing nervously at the dark woods surrounding them. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, as if they were being spoken by someone standing just behind the trees. That night, Tessa and Mike went missing. The others searched frantically, calling their names, but there was no trace of them. Their tents were undisturbed, their belongings still neatly packed. It was as if they had simply vanished. As dawn broke, the remaining 4 friends packed up their things and fled the forest. They didn't stop until they were miles away. When they reached the nearest town, they reported their friend's disappearance to the authorities. Search parties scoured the forest for weeks, but Mike and Tessa were never found. Locals still talk about the Witchwood Forest, warning hikers about the whispers in the trees. They say the forest doesn't like visitors, and sometimes it keeps them. Story 3. The Cabin by the Lake. Tucked away in the middle of nowhere was Blackwater Lake, surrounded by dense forest and rumored to be haunted. The lake had once been a popular summer destination, but a series of tragic drownings decades ago had driven people away. Now, it was a place only the bravest or most foolish campers dared to visit. Sam, Claire, and Tom were the latter. The 3 friends had always enjoyed urban legends and spooky places, so when they heard about the lake, they jumped at the chance to spend a weekend there. They rented a small, run-down cabin near the water's edge and arrived late Friday evening. The cabin was old, its wooden walls creaking with age. The windows were grimy, and a faint, musty smell permeated the air. Outside, the lake was eerily calm, reflecting the trees that lined its shore. The friends laughed off the unsettling atmosphere, chalking it up to the lake's reputation. That night, Sam awoke to the sound of someone crying. It was soft, almost muffled, but unmistakable. He sat up in bed, listening. The sound seemed to come from outside, near the lake. Curiosity got the better of him, and he quietly slipped out of bed and opened the front door. The night air was cold and still. The moon cast a silvery glow over the lake, but there was no one in sight. The crying had stopped. Sam stepped out onto the porch, squinting at the shoreline. That's when he saw it, just barely visible in the moonlight. A figure standing in the water, waist deep. It looked like a woman, her hair hanging limp over her face. He took a step closer, and the figure slowly turned to face him. Her eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto his, and a blood-curdling scream filled the air. Sam froze in terror as the figure vanished beneath the water's surface. The next morning, Sam told Claire and Tom what he had seen. They didn't believe him at first, but when they found wet footprints leading from the lake to the porch, their skepticism quickly faded. That night, they all heard the crying. It echoed across the lake, louder than before. They packed their things and left the cabin without looking back. Weeks later, they learned that the figure Sam had seen matched the description of a woman who had drowned in Blackwater Lake years ago. Her body never recovered. Some say her spirit still haunts the lake, luring unsuspecting visitors to a watery grave.